welcome to the On List. I'm gone almost this whole year so far without doing a single video about anything Avon related, which is really unusual for me because, as you know, Avon is kind of my biggest thing, right? So I decided, hey, let's do an Avon video for 2025. But I'm stepping out of the normal comfort zone for this channel, and I'm talking about Avon Feminines. I do feminine fragrance videos every so often, mostly shorts, but I do some long forms. However, I've never dedicated a single video to Avon feminine perfumes, and I'm going to do that now. So it goes without saying that the bulk and majority of all Avon fragrances were marketed to women. The whole concept behind the house, as I've said in other videos, was to get women buying and selling from each other, especially during the 1800s when a lot of women were homemakers. This was a way of creating a social selling, as the founder originally called it. Now we call that sort of thing multi-level marketing or soliciting, but back then it was deemed social selling. But they could not only make extra money, but be empowered to be more entrepreneurial. But in the end, products like perfume were primarily bought by women anyway. So buying from someone of the same sex in those days, right, a woman was more likely to be more comfortable buying from another woman than going to some jack-off guy at the counter of a local store and asking him what smells good, because like he's gonna know. So that was one of the big key proponents to Avon's success, and they kind of carried that whole empowering women, focusing on women through most of their company history, from California Perfume Company until they changed their name to Avon officially in 1931, I believe. They had Avon as a separate nameplate for their cosmetics and skincare, but they didn't call the whole company Avon until 1931. So Avon perfumes, which was their bread and butter for a long time, it wouldn't be until the 1980s that makeup and skincare would overtake the perfumes. So the primary product bought and sold from the 1880s up until the 1980s, so a whole century, the primary product for the first century of the brand's existence was the perfume. And it wasn't until the 80s that their makeup and, again, their skincare began to outsell their perfume. And a lot of that had to do with the proliferation of shopping malls, television shopping, other ways for people to get products, wider varieties of products, especially people who lived in rural areas in Middle America, which was the biggest customer base for Avon, small towns where there weren't many shopping options. A lot of catalog businesses did really well in those areas, not just Avon, but Sears with their catalog, Finger Hut with their catalog, okay, any kind of catalog-based business, door-to-door business, Fuller Brushman, okay, these were more successful in areas that didn't have big department stores and shopping malls. But by the 80s that would change. And thus, people wanted the latest and greatest designer perfumes. They didn't have to take a plane trip to New York anymore or a plane trip to Chicago or LA. They had a local mall, usually within an hour of their small town or less, 20-30 minute drive from where they lived. They had a local mall. They could go there, check out the latest Dior, the latest Chanel, and with all the discounters and big box stores like Kmart, right, that were also selling these products, suddenly they weren't just stuck with Avon anymore. And that's when that whole pivoted away. But Avon feminine fragrances continued to still be very popular. But the thing is, really, their market was changing. Avon themselves invested a lot of money into designer brands in the 80s, diversifying their portfolio. They wanted to break into higher markets. So they did things like collaborate with designers. So they had some collaborations with celebrities too in that era. And they outright purchased Parfum Stern. So that gave them access to Oscar de la Renta. They had Giorgio Beverly Hills, a number of designer labels under their belt that they carried into the 90s before they sold that stuff off again to somebody else. I think Elizabeth Arden picked up most of that stuff from Avon when they sold it off, but for a while Avon was making designer perfumes and celebrity perfumes, both. So the actual in-house Avon branded stuff, well, that was only going to sell to the established customer. And I'm talking the women's stuff. I've already done videos about the men's stuff, okay? So you already know a lot of the men's stuff was sold to Dad, Uncle Joe, older brothers. The younger, hipper crowd wasn't going to wear Avon colognes. They were going to go check out the latest Calvin Klein, like I said, at the mall. But mom, sister, people who had kind of grown up with Avon by that point were still buying it. But again, that's a different market from the more trend-conscious, younger, hipper women that wanted to have the latest designers, the things they saw on TV and commercials, the things they saw in magazines, which wasn't Avon anymore. Avon really stopped advertising their perfumes mostly, not completely, but mostly stopped advertising their perfumes that way by the 80s. They focused on, again, the makeup. So Avon perfumes for women got really kind of strange in the 80s into the 90s. They got really oddly mature, you know, and anachronistic in some cases. Mix up of older styles with a splash of something new. A lot of this was due to a transition the brand was having from doing all their own perfumes in-house, as they had done since the 1800s, to contracting out to IFF, Givaudan, you know, Firmenich, stuff like that. Adolf Getting Company was the original in-house perfumer for Avon. David H. McConnell purchased A. Getting, absorbed them into Avon, and then that became Avon's internal laboratory for, again, about 100 years. So all the really classic Avons from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, those were basically made by what remained of the Adolf Getting Company was making that stuff. But by the 80s, when Ann Gottlieb and Associates was hired on to creatively direct Avon, to get them out of their slump, their perfume slump, because, like, again, the makeup was outselling. Ann Gottlieb's idea was to stop doing the internal stuff. It's more expensive. Sourcing materials internally was more expensive because a lot of the big aroma houses, again, like IFF, Firmenich, Givaudan, those guys, they had patented materials that you couldn't use unless you worked with their perfumers. So at that time, it seemed both more expensive and creatively limiting to source your own materials and make your own perfumes, at least on that big macro scale. Nowadays, indie perfumers and artisanal perfumers do all kinds of creative stuff on their own, making their own materials in many cases where they can't source them. But it's a different world from Avon in the 80s, trust me, different world. So, now I've got a bit of preamble. I've spent almost 10 minutes actually giving you this preamble. Now I can break into some of my favorite Avon fragrances. Some of them are up here on the shelf, way up high, so I got to climb on my little step stool to reach them. You've never seen me access that top shelf on camera, so now you get to. Okay, so here we go. Some of the really early stuff that Avon did in like the mid-century, some of that stuff was, to say the least, it was very inspired. But the same can be said for a lot of fragrances post-war. A lot of stuff after World War II, when the world was going back to normal and rebuilding. A lot of brands, whether they were American brands, British brands, they all looked at what was popular pre-war. So basically, a lot of brands looked at Guerlain, looked at Caron, looked at Houbigant, looked at Chanel, right? And said, okay, that's what we should be doing. And thus, as crazy as it may seem now, but 30, 40, 50 years removed from when those fragrances were first released, like Shalimar in 25, Number 5 in 21, right? Mitsoko in 1919, a lot of these early Carons and Houbigants and such, Quelque Fleur in 1917. A lot of these perfumes were still being riffed on, were still inspiring new fragrances in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, when you think they wouldn't be anymore. These days, that would never happen. You would never see a modern designer or a company like Avon pattern a fragrance after something from 30, 40 years prior. Like 30 years would be the 90s, right? We don't see that now. I mean, Tom Ford sometimes does that because that's his quirk, but, most major brands don't look to the past for continued success, but they did at that point in time because the world effectively came to a stop. The Great Depression, right? World Wars really put a stymie in things. So it is really no surprise at all that when Avon released Topaz in the late 50s, that it was basically a floral aldehyde chypre, not altogether unlike a Number 5, like Arpège, which came out in 27 by Lanvin Arpège. Something along those lines. Joy, like from 1930, Patou Joy. So, in case you're wondering, this is actually an original 1950s bottle of Topaz. This is as deep vintage as it gets. And in this time period, spray bottles were pressurized. So this is a pressurized spray bottle. And Avon labels this as a cologne mist. That's what they call this. But it is not a body spray, and it really isn't a cologne, because this is strong. So this is a full eau de toilette, or parfum de toilette, as they might have called it. If Guerlain had made this, Guerlain would have called this a parfum de toilette. Avon's calling it a cologne mist, but it is not a cologne. But when you push this sprayer down, you get a constant stream of fragrance until you let it go. So for people who are not used to that coming out of a glass bottle, they're like, wait, what? Because it's supposed to be, right? But no, you push this down, you're going to exhaust the entire bottle if you don't let it go. So you have to meter it yourself. You have to know when to stop. And the other big scary thing about these is these pressurized bottles like this, people also don't like them because they can leak, they can not physically explode, but explode in terms of the seal breaks and then all the gas escapes, and then you can't get the fragrance out. Because the fragrance is not actually just sitting in here, it's completely atomized and pressurized. So it is like a can of shave cream. It is like a can of WD-40, where it's not just liquid sitting in a can with gas behind it or underneath of it, it's all interspersed. Don't shake these though. You don't want to do that. And they are rubberized too, so I wouldn't drop this on a concrete floor, but if you have an oopsie on the carpet, you're probably going to be okay. Yeah, it's a very fleshy, yellow floral smell, so I get, of course, the aldehydes. You get a sort of ylang kind of thing here. Very fleshy, musky. There's civet in this. There's sandalwood in this. There's oak moss in this. What makes this different from a number 5 or something like that is the aldehydes in this are much lighter. This is more of a floral fragrance. It's much more of a yellow floral. So it's very pretty. And it is as fresh as the day it was made in the 50s. Perfectly preserved because there's no oxygen in this bottle. And when I spray this, gas discharges, fragrance discharges, but no air goes in. So it just continues to stay perfect until I manage to use it all up. I don't see myself doing that though. Another one I really love, this one's a little newer. This is from the late 60s, early 70s. 1970 is the release year, but with Avon it's always a little iffy, you never really know. And it's called Charisma. Charisma is one that my mother used to wear a lot, and it stayed on the market for a long time. It had several reissues, and I have different bottles of this. Like, I can show you. This is one of the older Charisma bottles. This isn't the very first one. The very first one had like a little gem on top, kind of the same way that this does. The first one had like a little gem on top. This one came a little later. So I think this is a 70s bottle and not like a later, like an early 69, 70 bottle would have the little gem, but mid to late 70s would have it like this. And this one is also not pressurized. This is a stem, as you can see. This is a regular spray, what they call natural spray. And yeah, this is a very soapy floral chypre, but it's got civet, but the civet and the soap kind of battle each other. So on one hand you get rosewood, savan accord. On the other hand you get the civet. You get a rose, you get a jasmine, you get a geranium in here. You get a lot of vetiver, actually. This is a surprisingly woody fragrance. For a woman's fragrance, this is surprisingly woody, which is what makes it kind of unisex to me. I think a guy can really very easily pull this off because of the woodiness. But it's floral, it's soapy, it's pretty. Just kind of imagine, if you will, if someone took something like Paco Rabanne Pour Homme with the rosewood in that and mashed it up with like a rose fragrance from the time. So like an Aromatics Elixir or one of those. But this predates both of those fragrances. This came out first, so you can't really say it's a mix of anything that came later, right? It wouldn't make sense. Go back up here. Put these back up top. This top shelf. I really get nervous coming up here. But this is where I have to keep these things. Okay, so now I'm going to break out this one. And we're going to break out this one. This one is called Avon Emprise from 1970. I want to say 75 or 76. I'm not exactly sure. Very green, citric, floral chypre. This is right in the train of thought of something like a Jantu, like a Charlie by Revlon, okay? Givenchy Toi, if you like that fragrance. This is in that sort of style. So you get big bergamot in the opening, hyacinth, okay? A little bit of aldehydes, not much. More citrus than anything. Very bright, very citrusy. The florals are more white floral, so you're getting muguet, you're getting again, hyacinth muguet, you're getting stuff like rose, geranium again, iris, really just kind of a big bitter green. Galbanum is in here, and the oak moss is absolutely chewy. The oak moss is like chewy in its fragrance. So if you're a moss junkie, and I know a lot of you guys, like, you do this, you worship the oak moss like it's crack cocaine. That to me sounds like a personal problem, but if you're one of those guys, if you speak in tongues and writhe on the floor when you smell oak moss, then you might just OD on this. Just be careful. This one is called Emprise. It comes in this cool little... Now this is what's called an ultra cologne spray. So Avon basically looked at Estee Lauder and said, we want to do some of that. So Estee Lauder was making super colognes at that time. So obviously Avon couldn't call theirs super cologne, so they called it ultra cologne. But it's really not a cologne. And just the same as with Estee Lauder and their super colognes, ultra cologne just means sprayable parfum. This is like parfum concentration. This is very, very dense, very, very heavy, lasts absolutely forever, which is why you only get like 1.8 ounces of this. You don't even get 2 ounces because you don't need it. It's so potent. Super potent. Fill a room with that. This one is from the early 50s. And this is called To a Wild Rose. Unfortunately, due to the age of this bottle, the gold leaf hasn't really stayed on the bottle anymore. But this is the original packaging. Avon actually reused this bottle for a number of fragrances, but it first appeared with this one in the early 50s. So it kind of has that 50s look about it. And it is called Crystal Cologne. And they call it Crystal Cologne because you can see through like crystal. It's kind of stupid, right? But it's effectively still an eau de toilette, though. Strength-wise, this is an eau de toilette. Now, this is a rose fragrance in theory. To a Wild Rose, released in the early 50s, but it really is a very complex fragrance. It is, again, you get bergamot aldehydes in the opening. You get rose, jasmine, carnation, oak moss. There's like a sour kind of pyrrolonish accord in here. So some kind of anise mousse de sax thing going on. And of course Avon has their amber in this. But when this dries down, it becomes very, very much more of a typical kind of ambery, floral chypre, sour, musky. Rose is there, but if you're looking for like a rose perfume that's about the rose, this one isn't going to do it. So it's a quirky name, being called To a Wild Rose, but it really isn't a rose fragrance in that sense. Probably why I like it, honestly. I like it when things surprise me. So, and I have that in oil too. So, okay, here's another thing. Men never got these, of course, but women did. And they are perfumed oils. Here is my To a Wild Rose perfume roulette. And this is just straight up sludge. This is more or less an attar. That's what we would call this now. You know, by Middle Eastern standards, this would be an attar or a mukalat or something like that. But Avon did these, and there was a perfume and an oil base, highly concentrated, ridiculously concentrated. So, I mean, look at that, okay? And you put this behind your ears. You use a little roller ball, which the roller ball, despite, 50 plus, 60, 70 years of age, this rollerball still works. It takes a little coaxing if it's dried up. You got to roll it a bit back and forth to get it going again. Once you get some of the oil actually on the roller, it'll move. And here's another one. This is for a fragrance called Elusive, which came out in '68. I'm going to show you the big spray of that too. But this is the cutest, most petite looking, like Scheherazade, Princess Jasmine from Aladdin looking bottle you'll ever see. This looks like it could come right out of like a Bollywood film set with the pink and the gold and the paisleys. But believe you me when I say that this is not a cute fragrance. It is a wolf in sheep's clothing. When you smell this stuff, oh mama, this does a what if. Okay, what if Kouros had originally been composed for a woman and launched 12, 13 years earlier? Well, guess what? It's not a what if, because that actually happened. Not intentionally, obviously. Pierre Bourdon did not create this fragrance in '68, but this has a very similar scent profile to Kouros by Yves Saint Laurent. It has got a big animalis note right in the center, big white florals, just like Kouros, big patchouli, big honey, big benzoin, big incense. This is also a distant cousin to something like Rien, Etat Libre d'Orange Rien, or Rien Intense Incense, both of those. And when you smell this, the only thing that really makes it different from Kouros is the floral arrangement is much more typically feminine in the way that fragrances were in the 60s. So again, think stuff like, you're going to get white florals, you're going to get more jasmine in this, you're going to get rose in this, you're going to get ylang in this, you're going to get carnation in here. You're going to get a lot of those like really pretty pink florals that get you that generic feminine perfume smell. But then you're going to dump a bunch of Kouros style muskiness and, like I said, the patchouli and the honey and everything else and the incense. It's really, really crazy. And the perfume oil, don't even get me started. Perfume oil is, oh my god, yeah, this is a highly animalic fragrance. So this will test you. It will test you. Avon sometimes very frequently actually, did little decorative decanters. This is the Elusive in its true cologne form. This is actual cologne. And in its cologne form, it has much more of the top notes, so you get much more bergamot, more aldehydes. So the cologne feels less like Kouros than that spray toilette does. And the oil obviously also leans more into the animalics because it's more base heavy being an oil. So all three of these are different facets, but that middle spray bottle is going to be the most reminiscent of Kouros. This cologne is going to be more like your typical women's chypre of the time, just again, very animalic, very ball of Versailles type of fragrance. And then that oil is just going to knock you right on your ass. Right on your ass. Very shocking for obviously for an Avon fragrance made for women. Also, a lot of you who grew up in the 80s with Avon, You probably have seen this before. This came out in '87, so this is the newest thing I've shown on this video yet. We're right at the very end of the video. I could do a part 2, actually. If you guys want a part 2, I'm more than happy to do a part 2. But this is Imari. This is another floral chypre fragrance, more green, little musky, little woody. This fragrance would be a bit out of step. Like I told you how in the 80s they were focusing more on their older customers and not really pushing the envelope much with newer fragrances. Not until the end of the 80s when they began to switch gears and use oil houses to design their perfumes for them. But this was one of the last like in-house things they did, and you can tell with this that it was really just not with the times. People were wearing stuff like Giorgio and big heavy tuberose and jasmine fragrances. People were wearing stuff like Oscar and Calyx with the cucumber and the melon, you know, beautiful. They weren't wearing this. This fits more in line with the 70s and late 60s, even though I'm sure it sold very well in the 80s because the average Avon customer at that point was older anyway. But just kind of gives you an idea of how not with the times they were when this came out. Even though I love it. I love this stuff. And yes, I would wear this. I've got another bottle of this somewhere too, actually. Someone gave me a second bottle of this, so I've got two. I've got enough Imari now for a little while. But that's it, guys. That is Avon Feminines. Let's just say part 1. And do part 2 a little later on, and then we can carry on, and I can show you some other Avon Feminines that I really enjoy. And there are lots of them, like I said. There are way too many for me to make a comprehensive video about all of them. It's not going to happen. I just pick my favorites and let you guys discover the rest on your own. This has been the Unlist.